in Israel, but it's become now increasingly a regional war. And we also know, many of us, that this is a contentious issue that's inflamed passions in multiple camps. So again, my goal here is to look at the background history of some of the key events and turning points that have led to this current conflict between particularly Hamas and the state of Israel. So my goal is to do that. My goal is not to advocate a position. In fact, if I do that blatantly, at least, I'm really abdicating my responsibility as an historian. So as Rachel said, there's a lot of history here. And I'm certainly not going to try to do it comprehensively. That would be impossible. I'm looking at key turning points, key events, key factors that I think explain the current conflict. So let's look at a map of the region we're talking about. And that would be essentially this area where I'm circling, the Eastern Mediterranean, often called Palestine, a term that actually the ancient Greeks coined, and the Romans continued essentially. A later term, the Levant, roughly the same region, this Eastern Mediterranean. The French coined that term, and it came into English roughly 1500. But we are, for the most part, going to use the term Palestine. I know even that might be controversial for some people, but that was a term used certainly by the Arabs, and it was also a term used by the Jews in that region as well. I'm certainly not going to go back and try to trace the whole history of this region, because again, we'd be doing archaeology, we'd be doing anthropology, we'd be here for hours and hours and hours. And quite frankly, I don't really have the expertise to do that. I think one key thing to note is this is a region that was a crossroad of empires. It was a region overrun and conquered time and again by multiple empires, going back to the Egyptians, and then coming up to not much more than 100 years ago, the penultimate empire, the next to last that ruled this region, was the Ottoman Empire. And this is really where I'm going to start my historical analysis, is looking at the Ottoman Empire, because that empire and what happened to it post-World War I are really critical in understanding the subsequent events in Palestine, or this region. So I have a map of the Ottoman Empire up on the left. That's circa 1914. The lighter shades of tan are the Ottoman Empire at its peak. The Ottoman Empire, the center, or the core of it, would be modern-day Turkey, Anatolia. But again, the Ottomans conquered a much larger swath of land than that, which you see depicted on the map. But certainly by 1914, and really as early as the 18th century, arguably, the Ottoman Empire was in decline, in part because other empires were emerging around it, and particularly some of the European empires, the Habsburgs, for example, the Russian Empire. So actually, it was Tsar Nicholas I who apparently coined the term the sick man, or the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, an empire in decline, but again, still in control of this region right up through World War I. On the right, we have a map of the administrative subdivisions, circa 1915, that the Ottomans came up with to rule this region. So you can just take a look at that. One other important fact is this was a region with a pluralistic population that changed multiple times and was still changing, certainly in the 19th century and into the 20th century. There were Muslims here, there were Christians here, there were people that were neither, the Druze, for example. There were Arabs, there were non-Arabs, there were Europeans, there were Africans, there were Asians. So again, it was a crossroads of empire, but it was a crossroads of peoples also. Nationalism is a big part of this story. And we're going to start with Jewish nationalism, particularly Zionism, but we also have to talk about Arab nationalism as well. But certainly Zionism is a key factor, obviously in the emergence of Israel, but also in the subsequent clash between Jews and Arabs, particularly in this region. So I'm not going to try to give you a whole history of Zionism, but it's a movement that emerged in the 19th century, particularly in Europe. And on the left, you see the leading spokesman of the movement, certainly early on, Theodor Herzl, who was an Austrian journalist, eloquent writer, and kind of one of the moving forces between this early movement, or behind this early movement. And in 1896, Herzl published a pamphlet. It's not really a book, it's pretty short, called The Jewish State. If you're interested in that, you can certainly find it online, among other places. It's pretty easy to find. One of the things he does in this work is to kind of summarize what is Zionism. And without using his words, I'm going to give you my own summary of what Herzl and the other Zionists were arguing in favor of. The Jews were a minority population, subject to discrimination, to outright persecution wherever they lived. Certainly in Europe, that had been the case for centuries. And again, the degree to which they were discriminated against varied tremendously. By the 19th century, certainly, particularly in Western Europe, Central Europe, that was changing. The Jews were more assimilated. They certainly had far more rights as citizens, or even equal rights, at least nominally, in many of those states. Ditto the United States. But in Eastern Europe, not to the same extent at all. Well, here's one of the keys of Zionism. The creation of a Jewish homeland, quote unquote, was necessary to provide a place of refuge for Jews worldwide. So the Jews were a nation, which is really what Herzl's arguing, but they're a nation without a country. They're a minority population in every country they live. They need their own nation, in part for security. But that was only part of it. Also in part because Zionism was meant to be a project to strengthen the bonds between Jews wherever they lived, partly by attracting them to this home, a place of cultural and social renewal, rebirth, modernization, economic advancement was certainly part of this too. So again, to use my own words, the Jews would have this homeland, which they would transform, but in transforming the homeland, they'd be transforming themselves also as a people and forging strong bonds between themselves. One of the debates, though, of course, was where would this homeland be? And we just assume from the get-go all Zionists believed it should be in Palestine, but it's not that simple. Actually, there in this work, The Jewish State, Herzl argued potentially for Argentina as being a homeland. But and a few years later, actually, there was a serious debate about Uganda, which was British colony at this point in East Africa. The British were actually open to a Jewish homeland in Uganda, at least as a temporary measure. But that never came to be. Herzl put his finger on something key, and this is from The Jewish State. Palestine is our ever memorable historic home. The very name of Palestine would attract our people with a force of marvelous potency. And of course, he was right. And by our ever memorable historic home, he's talking about the ancient kingdoms of Jews that did exist in that region long ago. One other quote from his work: "The Jews who wish for a state will have it. We shall live at last as free men on our own soil and die peacefully in our own homes." So there's a great dream here, but a dream that would actually be put to action very, very quickly. So the following year, the first Zionist Congress met in Basel, Switzerland, and the World Zionist Organization was formed. And by the way, the flag of Israel, is actually the flag of the Zionist organization. They hit on the Star of David and those color schemes. So here is the program that they agreed upon: the promotion by appropriate means of the settlement of Eretz Israel, of Jewish farmers, artisans, and manufacturers. So what is that? Let's pull up a map. Well, even to this day, there's not exactly an agreement as to what the boundaries of that is. But again, it's a reference to the historic kingdoms of Jews in that region, particularly the kingdom of Israel and Judea. But it also could mean the scriptural interpretation of the bounds of Israel. And that's really what we're looking at here. But at any rate, it roughly corresponds with Palestine. Also, in this case, parts of Lebanon. There are other interpretations that make it much larger than this, actually. But clearly, the goal was to settle Jews here. This would be the homeland. Part two, again, the idea of uniting Jews and wherever they are. Number three, strengthening and fostering Jewish national sentiment. So again, the idea of Jewish nationalism, kind of pan-Jewish nationalism, which would flourish in this new homeland. And then number four, preparatory steps toward obtaining the consent of governments were necessary in order to reach the goals of Zionism. So keep in mind, the Jews could not simply move in here. This was part of the Ottoman Empire. The goal was for the Jews to purchase land. And as it turned out, in the 1850s and 60s, the Ottoman Empire changed its laws in such a way that they became more possible, including for foreigners, to purchase foreign land. The goal of the Ottomans at this point was to develop this, and they weren't particularly concerned about who would do the developing, whether it was Arabs, Jews, Europeans, or others. We also have to keep in mind there were Jews in Palestine before the Zionist movement began. And not huge numbers. The estimate, 1880, so kind of on the eve of Zionism, 20 to 25,000. So they probably constituted low end 2% of the total population, high end about 5%. And some of those people had roots that stretched back centuries and perhaps even longer than. By 1903, that number had climbed to 60,000, and what you see there is the momentum, if you will, of Zionism. Jews did begin to move there in significant numbers, and that would continue right up until the creation of the State of Israel and after. But I don't think this story is just about Zionism. You also have to look at sort of a parallel movement that was occurring roughly the same time, maybe a little later, Arab nationalism. The map I have here, the countries in the green are actually members of the Arab League, which was formed 1945. But that gives you some idea of the geographic distribution of the Arab peoples. And again, the main thing that links them is language. To some extent, religion, although we have to be careful, not all Arabs are Muslims, although most are. And obviously not all Muslims agree on things either, if you know some of the schisms, particularly between the Sunni and the Shia factions of Islam. But in the 19th century, Arab nationalism really began as a literary movement that looked backward to the Arab past, and I should say real and sort of imagined, and extolled it. And we have to keep in mind, in the Islamic world, following the rise of Islam and the creation of this Arab world, the Arabs, or really the Islamic peoples, led the world in some important areas, made huge advances in science, mathematics, medicine, architecture, and I could go down the list. So that's partly what this movement began to do, is look back and say, what's happened? The Arab peoples at one time were the envy of the world, were cutting edge peoples, had vibrant, strong societies. By the 19th century, though, particularly in the Ottoman Empire, that past was long gone. And so this movement would evolve from a literary movement slowly to a political movement, critical of the Ottomans, particularly the Turks in particular, who really ruled the Ottoman Empire. Similar to Zionism, there was a call for cohesiveness among all Arab peoples. It was a pan movement. It wasn't a movement even unique to just Palestine. It tried to call all Arab peoples together to realize their commonalities and to work together, again, for cultural and social revival, modernization. But as a political movement, this movement didn't really gain much traction until World War I, which we'll get to in a minute. One other thing I think that differentiates it from Zionism is we have this tension and rivalry between Arab nationalism and what we could call Islamic nationalism, the idea of the Ummah, that all Muslims are one nation or community. And those two things sometimes work in tandem, but sometimes actually work in opposition to one. In case you're wondering who this gentleman is, some of you, if you're old enough or know the history or are buffs of history, you might know this fellow was president of Egypt from 1954 to 70, Gamal Nasser, who actually took part in a coup and arguably was the most charismatic and famous advocate of pan-Arab nationalism. We will mention him again in our story. So let's jump ahead to World War I. The map shows us the Arab Revolt, which I'll get to in a minute, but the blue arrows indicate where there was some serious fighting. The Ottomans were part of or became part of the Central Powers, i.e. they allied with the Germans and Habsburgs against the Entente powers, the British, the French, the Russians, later the Americans, and I'm leaving out some of the minor powers here. But it was particularly the British who campaigned in this region to gain territory, but also to tie down Ottoman forces, in part to help the Russians. So Gaza, the Gaza Strip, this area was a scene of heavy fighting during World War I. There was another campaign in the modern-day Iraq, the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. We're going to kind of ignore that. But again, Palestine was fought over. In 1916, the British were able to convince a group of Arabs led by the Hashemites. That was the family that had governed Mecca for about 1,000 years, to rebel against the Ottomans. So now we have arguably the first real sign of an emerging Arab nationalism, where the Arabs are seeing themselves as different, at least the Arabs who supported the revolt, and there were significant numbers who did. They're seeing themselves as different than the Ottomans. And keep in mind, the Turks were not Arabs. So the British are going to take full advantage of this and used the Arabs as allies in this war against the Turks with considerable success. So what were the Arabs going to get out of this? Well, one, obviously, they would be freed from the yoke of the Ottoman Empire. Not that they were exactly oppressed, but they had some grievances, which we could talk about later, perhaps. But first and foremost, they were promised their own independent state if this rebellion succeeded and the British won the war. That state would be in what was called Greater Syria, roughly the area around modern Syria. So on the one hand, the British get the Arabs to revolt. On the other hand, the British and the French, that very same year the revolt begins, are coming up with what's called the Sykes-Picot agreements, which was an agreement to divvy up the Ottoman Empire between the British and the French after the war. And the Arabs would find out about this and not be happy about it, by the way, but nonetheless. Another key event during this war was the Balfour Declaration. So the Zionists understood if they were going to have a homeland, i.e. eventually an independent state of some sort in Palestine, they were either going to have to deal with the Ottomans, who weren't going to give them that, or now they could deal with the British, who were overrunning that region, and in fact would end up with it after the war. So in 1917, Arthur Balfour, who was the British Foreign Secretary, on behalf of the British government, wrote this letter, which is known as the Balfour Declaration, but it stated an official position of the British government. The letter was actually written to Lord Walter Rothschild, who was a leading Zionist, British also. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. Okay, so that's the first part. So the British are supporting the Zionist goal, the key one, to establish this homeland in Palestine. But if we go down a little further, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews, I should say, in any other country. So it's a carefully worded statement. On the one hand, yes, the British will support this establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, but not at the expense of non-Jews. So in a minute, we're going to talk about how the British had to straddle this line and try to achieve both of those things, if they could. Obviously, we know who wins the war. The British, or I should say the Central Powers, lose, the Entente Powers win, and indeed the Ottoman Empire was doomed by this war. This was really the end of this empire. Let's go forward. So, after the war, keep in mind we have the creation of the League of Nations, in large part because of the efforts of Woodrow Wilson, US president. The Ottoman Empire is going to be divided up. Now, the initial goal of the British and the French was to divide the whole thing up amongst themselves, and the Italians would get a little piece of it too. But it didn't quite happen that way, because in 1923, the Turks would actually declare their own republic and seize power here. But the rest of this region, including Palestine, that's what we're going to focus mostly on here, was indeed divided up between the British, the Palestine, Transjordan, Iraq, and then the French would get Lebanon and Syria. Again, the idea of a mandate was, in theory, these were not colonies. They were not meant to be permanent holdings by the British and the French. They were only meant to be governed by the British and the French until the peoples here were deemed ready to govern themselves. And of course, that would not happen in the short term, but it would happen right after World War II. I think it's important to point out that as part of the British mandate in Palestine, the Balfour Declaration was official British policy. In addition, Jews kept emigrating to Palestine. So we have some figures, 1904 to 29, it's about 160,000. So I wouldn't call that a flood, but it's a pretty steady trickle. And keep in mind, they're still a minority population, but they're becoming a larger and larger minority on Palestine. 1930 to 39, you really do have something of a flood. And largely that's due to the rise of Nazism in Germany and Jews fleeing the Nazis, in part coming to Palestine because of the Zionist attraction, perhaps, but also in part because countries such as Britain, France, and the United States were reluctant to take large numbers of Jewish refugees. So in some cases, the best option, or maybe the only option, was to go to Palestine. Well, imagine what the Arabs felt like. On the one hand, they don't get their own state. That the British and the French reneged on that. The promise under the mandate was eventually they would get multiple states, but that hadn't happened. And the Jews keep coming to Palestine, and they have the support of the British to create, if not an independent state initially, at least some sort of autonomous region. And that's happened by the 1920s, certainly. So now you have a clash, an increasing clash between Arabs and Jews over who's going to have primacy in Palestine. Obviously, the British have primacy in the short term, but among, if you will, the subject peoples, the colonized peoples, who's going to have primacy over the land? Let me just read you a couple of quotes. I think we have a little bit of time. One from the leading newspaper of the Arabs in Palestine. I think it still is, by the way. Palestine. This is an editorial in 1914. Whereas the Jewish immigration to Palestine was back, oh, excuse me, that's not the quote I want. 10 years ago, the Jews were living as Ottoman brothers, loved by all Ottoman races, living in the same quarters, their children going to the same schools. The Zionists put an end to all that, prevented any intermingling with the indigenous population. They boycotted the Arabic language and the Arab merchants and declared their intention of taking over the country. So it's a pretty strong position. But again, many Arabs believed that's exactly what was happening. And in a sense, we have validation of this from a leading Zionist called a revisionist Zionist, who kind of took a very militant view of Zionism, that the Jews would have their homeland even by force if necessary. A fellow named Zev Jabotinsky. This is an essay he wrote in 1923 about the Zionist movement in Palestine. Every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel. Now, not all Zionists were that blunt or realpolitik about it, but Jabotinsky was, and there were others who were too. This is a struggle between colonizers and indigenous peoples, and we are going to have our homeland. By the way, lest you think Jabotinsky was this heartless person, there's another side to him. He also argued that once that homeland was created, that any Arabs who lived there would have equal rights. He was absolutely determined that that would be the case. But the homeland would be created. There was violence during the 20s, and as the Arabs again saw the not the Israelis yet, the Jews as a threat to their primacy in the region, there were some violent incidents, but it was really in the 30s that this whole thing began to blow up, and the British had to try to control increasing violence. So the Arab Revolt, 1936 to 39, was a really massive uprising of the Arab peoples, which targeted British, but certainly targeted Jews too. And what this would lead to increasingly is the Jews forming their own, essentially, a government. Not yet governing an independent state, but nonetheless. And by the 30s, their own military force, the Haganah, in part to defend themselves, but in part to also strike back at the Arabs. The British, in part, allowed the Jews to arm themselves to defend themselves, but also would use the Jews to help put down this revolt. Because in point of fact, the Jews were very well organized, where the Arabs weren't always organized at all. The British now are, though, forced back into this problem. Keep in mind, under the Balfour Declaration, they had committed themselves to the creation of a Jewish homeland, but also not at the expense of non-Jewish peoples, i.e. the Arabs particularly here. Now they had to put their money where their mouths were, so to speak. So the Balancing Act included a partition plan, 1937, called the Peel Plan. Lord Robert Peel headed the commission that came up with this idea. And what it called for was the creation of a Jewish state, pretty small, only about 20% of Palestine. And also larger Arab states, so a two-state solution. Religious sites such as Jerusalem would be neutral, and populations would be resettled, i.e. Jews who would end up in the Palestinian state would be resettled into the Jewish state, and Arabs in the Jewish state would be resettled in the Palestinian state. The Jews were open to this and actually supported it, but not surprisingly, the Arabs utterly opposed it. So the British kind of dropped the idea. 1939, keep in mind now, war is looming in Europe. The British issue what's called a white paper, policy statement. And they call for a one-state solution, where there would be a Jewish autonomous region, essentially, within an independent Palestinian state. Not surprisingly, the Jews absolutely opposed this. But interestingly, the Arabs did too. The other important part of that 1939 white paper was, in part, to placate the Arabs and tamp down this revolt. The British placed very rigid restrictions on Jewish immigration into Palestine. They tried to slow it way, way down, and they did. They also put restrictions on Jews' ability to buy Arab lands. All right, let's jump ahead to World War II, and then we're almost to the creation of Israel. We still have more to do, but let's see how we can do here. We could talk a lot about World War II. I don't think this is the place to do that. Palestine was involved in that war, and certainly the Middle East. The Germans in particular, the Nazis, did try to cultivate ties with the Arabs and make trouble for the British and the French with some degree of success. But actually the British and the French, particularly the British, enlisted the help of both Arabs and Jews in fighting their enemies. So actually both sides would come out of this war with veteran soldiers, unfortunately, ready to fight the next war between the Israelis and the Arabs. Obviously, two other factors which are really important in terms of World War II. The most important thing is the Holocaust, this mass extermination of roughly 6 million Jews by the Nazis, generated at least considerable sympathy now for the Zionist movement and the creation of a state of Israel. In a sense, the Holocaust seemed to prove what Herzl and the early Zionists were arguing, that indeed the Jews need their own homeland for self-preservation, for protection. And not surprisingly, during the war and after, some of the survivors of the Holocaust would end up in Israel, and particularly after the first Arab-Israeli war, which we'll talk about in a minute, there was a tidal wave of Jewish immigration to the new state of Israel. When the war ended, though, the British are still in charge of this region, and the French too, but Palestine would be British mandate. But they're trying to find a way out of there, because what simply happened is once the war ended, violence between the Jews and the Arabs broke out again, but also violence between the Jews and the British, and to some extent even the Arabs and the Arabs. But now the Jews, the Zionists, are determined to force the British out and create that independent state. The British turned to the new organization, the United Nations, to come up with a solution. And that proposed solution was UN Resolution 181, which really falls back on the idea of the Peel Commission. We need to partition Palestine in some fashion. UN Resolution 181, there was a majority plan and a minority plan. So I'll mention both. Obviously, the majority plan passed, the minority plan didn't, but the UN put forward both plans to Jewish leaders and Arab leaders, British too. The majority plan was, again, a two-state solution, but with a linked economy. The Jews supported that idea, the Arabs opposed. The minority plan would have been, again, a one-state solution with an autonomous Jewish region and an autonomous Arab region. Both Arabs and Jews opposed that. So again, neither one of these plans had the support of both sides. And what this would lead to is really a stalemate until the British pulled out in May of 1948. And keep in mind, there was really warfare already gathering by 1947. The Arabs and the Jews were really preparing for that day when the British pulled out. May 1948, the British pull out. And the first thing that happens among the Jews is they declare independence. Their prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, the day before, actually, May 14th, 1948, the British leave, declares the state of Israel exists. The following day, the British leave, and the following day, there's a war in the region. I'll go back to that map in a second. The early part of the war was the surrounding Arab powers invading Israel in the hopes of defeating the Israelis, destroying this nascent state before it really takes root. But interestingly, the Arab leaders did not have a lot of confidence they were going to be able to do that. They knew the Israelis were actually, or the Jews, Israelis we can call them now, were better organized, not better armed necessarily. But so the early part of this war is the Israelis doing their best to beat back these invasions with considerable success. Much of the rest of the war is the Israelis counterattacking and driving back and seizing territory. So the war would sputter on until 1949 when finally there was a ceasefire. So the map I've pulled up here is actually the majority plan under UN Resolution 181. This is the map that they envision of the region. The Israeli state would look like this. And largely what they were doing is awarding territory based on the existing population demographics. The Arab state would look like this. There were little corridors that linked these regions. Jerusalem, which because of its importance in all the major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and also Islam, would under this plan be neutral territory, would be administered internationally. All would have access to it. But once this war ended, 1949, here were the boundaries in reality. So the Israelis had ended up conquering territory that went quite a bit beyond what the UN resolution was envisioning. But again, keep in mind, neither Arabs nor Jews agreed with, well, I should say the Arabs did support the UN Resolution 181, the majority plan, but the Arabs never did. But the reality on the ground in 1949 is you end up with an Israel quite a bit larger geographically than either, well, particularly any one of these partition plans envisioned. So that's one result of this first war. The Israelis not only emerged with their own country, they emerged victorious and with a larger country than certainly the UN envisioned. But now we have disputed boundaries. Not surprisingly, the Arab powers do not recognize these boundaries as legitimate. There's also a huge refugee problem. And in fact, some of that began even in the 20s and 30s to some extent, where Arabs and Jews were really discouraging their neighbors in various ways from living next to them. People were being driven off the land, but certainly that occurred large scale during this war. Something like 750,000 Arabs would be displaced. Much of that was they fled. Some of it was they were forced off the land. A smaller but still significant number of Jews were similarly displaced, either deliberately by Arabs or they fled to the new state of Israel. Jerusalem ended up divided, not as an international zone. The Israelis occupied, it was actually the lion's share of it, most of Western Jerusalem, but not the old city, which included the holy sites. That was occupied by the Jordanians. And then the other part to know here, and this really links to today, from this moment on, there's really a permanent state of war between Israel and at least some of its neighbors. At this point, all of them. So there are tensions, there are clashes, there are raids, there are bombardments, there are airstrikes, there are murders, there are assassinations. It waxes and wanes, but it never ends. The 50s and 60s, I'll go through kind of quickly, but there are a couple of important points there. 56, there was another war, actually, which I'm not going to get to in great detail, but between the British and the French, who were reacting to Nasser's seizure of the Suez Canal, nationalization of it, and then the Israelis occupying, or I should say, responding to Egyptian, what they saw as provocations, raids across the border, the closing of the Gulf of Aqaba to shipping. So the British and the French and the Israelis would actually combine to attack Egypt in 1956. And the Israelis would actually overrun the entire Sinai Peninsula, although then they withdrew. In the late 1950s, Fatah was formed. So this was a political party among Palestinians. The armed wing of the political party, which all of you know, I'm sure, is the Palestinian Liberation Organization. That would be formed in 1964. Yasser Arafat being instrumental in creation of both of these organizations. So, as the name suggests, the PLO dedicated to the liberation of the Palestinian peoples, at this point, the destruction of Israel and the creation of a Palestinian state by pretty much whatever means necessary. And I think certainly by this point, you have crystallizing a sense of a Palestinian identity. It goes back further than this, but certainly by the 50s, the 60s, the Palestinians are viewing themselves, perhaps first and foremost, not as Arabs, but as Palestinians. Another key turning point is the Six-Day War in 1967. Without getting into all the details, the Israelis launched a preemptive strike against their Arab neighbors who they believe were about to attack Israel. And in 6 days, they'd win this stunning, although very hard-fought victory, where they'd overrun Gaza, which again had been part of Egypt up to this point, the Sinai again, the West Bank of the Jordan River, which was part of Jordan, and then also the Golan Heights in Syria. So in 6 days, they took all of that territory, and they would occupy all of it for the next 15 years, some of it to this day. Well, the problem with occupying territory now is you give your enemies incentive to make your life miserable and get the territory back that they argue that was wrongfully seized from them. So again, the idea of Israel now struggling under not only this permanent war, but more territory it's got to police, administer, defend. Briefly, the Yom Kippur War, called in the Muslim world typically the Ramadan War in 1973. In this case, it was Egypt and Syria attacking Israel, gaining actually some element of surprise. And surprising the Israelis in terms of their competency, particularly the Egyptians. They fought much better in this than they had in 67. The Syrians, not so much, but nonetheless, launched a major assault on the Golan Heights. So I would argue this war is really important because Anwar Sadat, who succeeded Nasser in Egypt, really fought this war to reclaim the honor of the Egyptian military. The Egyptians were humiliated in 1967, so he was determined to launch an offensive to, as he put it, reclaim at least a centimeter of land in the Sinai. And the Egyptians did that and more. Although by the end of the war, the Israelis were certainly, again, pounding both the Syrians and the Egyptians. The UN would intervene, there'd be a ceasefire. But I really see this war setting the stage for Camp David, which happened under the Carter administration. They pushed for this. And give Carter a lot of credit, I think. I would argue that this was his most important foreign policy achievement, although it can be exaggerated in terms of its actual concrete impact, but nonetheless very important. Camp David, and you see here the two leaders who agreed to it, Sadat, the Egyptian president, and Menachem Begin, the Israeli prime minister at the time. And keep in mind, Begin was a hard-liner. Actually had been an ardent Zionist, a revisionist Zionist before the war, was involved in the bombing of the King David Hotel in fighting the British. So this was not a shrinking violet. This was a guy who had fought the Arabs tooth and nail. And in a sense, because he had those credentials, perhaps he could then go to the Israeli people and say, we can and should negotiate a peace treaty with the Egyptians. And that happened. So part one of Camp David was peace between Egypt and Israel, and a peace which has really lasted pretty well to this day. So that alone is a huge accomplishment. Egypt was the first country to cease the state of war with Israel and to recognize Israel, the first Arab country, I should say. Camp David also included what I'll call an outline for peace in the West Bank and Gaza, which involved multiple steps. But in fact, the two sides could not get past the first step, which was allowing some sort of Palestinian self-governance. So in the short term, that never happened. And the Palestinians were not part of the Camp David talks either, and in fact boycotted further negotiations. Peace with Jordan, that hadn't been decided. Security hadn't been decided. Camp David did decide permanent boundaries, which were extremely contentious. It didn't just decide this status of Jerusalem, which was contentious, or the status of refugees. In other words, were people displaced, let's say Arabs to Gaza when the state of Israel was created? If there was peace, would they be allowed to return to their old homes in Israel? And would Jews similarly be allowed to return to lands they had been displaced from? None of that was resolved by Camp David. But nonetheless, Camp David is an important step towards peace in the region. Well, in part because Camp David kind of ran aground early on, within a few years. Tensions rose in the region. There were other reasons for it too, but these tensions would break out in 1987 in what's called the First Intifada, which is a term that means multiple things, but it really means something like uprising. Well, this would go on from 87 to 93 and end up resulting in the deaths of about 2,000 people, Palestinians and Israelis, about 3/4 of them Palestinian. Now, why did this break out? Well, there's certainly another reason, multiple reasons this uprising would break out. A lot of it was, again, the peace talks were dead or going nowhere. You have all these unresolved issues. In 1982, the Israelis get involved in a war in Lebanon, which had been enmeshed in a civil war that started in 1975, that drew in the Syrians. So without getting into the whole history, some of the Palestinians saw this as an opportunity while the Israelis were bogged down in Lebanon. And by the way, while Israeli people were actually protesting this war as it went on, they saw this as an opportunity to take some sort of action against the Israelis, to force the Israelis to make concessions. In Lebanon, you have the emergence of Hezbollah, and interestingly enough, in the Palestinian regions, in Gaza and the West Bank in 1987, sort of a similar group, Hamas, different groups, but similar in ideology. And they're really Islamic nationalists. So the idea of Arab nationalism now is being, it's in tension with this idea of Islamic nationalism. Hezbollah gaining a lot of support among Muslims in Lebanon. And by the way, Hezbollah with very strong links to Iran also. And then Hamas emerging in the Palestinian regions in 1987, and Hamas being in large part behind this intifada. So for the most part, this was an insurgency, and it was a people's revolution. It was that. Civilians largely protesting, sometimes civilly, sometimes violently, and the Israelis responding, and obviously responding in many cases with force. There were bombings, there were murders, there were other things, but largely this is what it was. And the Palestinians understood that images such as you see here were going to gain them considerable public and media support around the world, where you have Israeli soldiers or police combating civilians, armed in many cases, not all, but many simply with bricks or rocks or what have you, or nothing at all for that matter. So this uprising would continue again for years, but it would spur the two sides into negotiations and lead eventually to the Oslo Accords. This is during the Clinton administration. So as early on as 88, the PLO recognized the state of Israel and renounced terrorism, at least officially. So that's a big step. Jordan would relinquish the West Bank, essentially giving it to a future Palestinian government. The Oslo Accords, the initial accords were agreed on in 93, but there would be some later steps undertaken in 94, 95, particularly implementation steps. So in 94, there's peace between Israel and Jordan. That's a huge step. 95, the creation of a Palestinian Authority. Something like it's a government, to be sure. So again, this was something outlined in the Camp David Accords. It would finally happen in 95. But the question is, it would be a government that would govern what exactly? And that's where the Oslo Accords had really serious limitations. So what the Accords did, because neither side could fully agree, was to divvy up both Gaza and the West Bank into both separate and joint regions. So let me kind of quickly explain. Where you see the solid green in the West Bank, those regions would be under the full control of the Palestinian Authority, both civil and military. But you don't really have a state here. You have a series of independent regions. The light green would be a Palestinian civil control, but joint security control, Israelis and Palestinians. And then the rest, and that's most of Gaza, the rest would still be under full Israeli control. So neither side, particularly the Palestinians, were not totally happy with this, but this was the most that Yitzhak Rabin and Arafat, and keep in mind, they answer to constituencies. This is the most they could agree on. But again, lots of unresolved issues. Security, permanent boundaries still haven't been established. Refugees, Jerusalem still up in the air. We should add, too, as part of the Oslo Accords, the Israelis would begin to construct a security barrier around the Gaza Strip. To some extent, the West Bank, too, but their main goal was Gaza. And to quote Rabin, I can find the quote quickly here. This path must lead to a separation, though not according to the borders prior to 1967. We want to reach a separation between us and them. We do not want a majority of the Jewish residents of the state of Israel, 98% of whom live within the borders of sovereign Israel, including a united Jerusalem, to be subject to terrorism. So we're going to build a wall. We're almost done, a little more. Again, the Oslo Accords achieved some middle ground between the two sides, but much was left unresolved. And similar to Camp David sort of foundering, the Oslo Accords would founder by the later 90s. And this would eventually lead to the Second Intifada, much more deadly than the first. So about 4,300 people killed in this 5-year period. And again, mostly Palestinians, but certainly many Israelis too. Some of this was a dispute over Jerusalem. One of the hallmarks of this Intifada was not simply civilians going out protesting and throwing rocks or bottles or what have you, but was suicide bombers, because you have a division now among, I think, what we can call more moderate Palestinian leaders, Fatah and the more radical Hamas and also Islamic Jihad, who were determined not to negotiate, but to fight and to kill if necessary. And so a spate of suicide bombings, which the Israelis really found difficult to stop. But they did try, and often their tactics were heavy-handed in order to try to stop this from happening. Ariel Sharon would become prime minister during this time. He would authorize Operation Defensive Shield. This is 2002, where the Israelis sent forces back into Gaza, parts of Gaza and the West Bank, to try to end this revolt. But shortly thereafter, he approved a disengagement plan. We're going to pull troops out of most of those regions, Gaza altogether, most of the West Bank, except where there are Israeli settlements. And he also approved the evacuation of all Israeli settlements in Gaza. So Gaza was really going to be given over to the Palestinians, at least in terms of settlement. So by 2005, the violence was abating. The two sides came to some agreement. There were Palestinian prisoners released by the Israelis. Each side agreed to a ceasefire. But the violence never really ended from this point. It abated, it slowed down, it lessened, but it never really ended. So let's get up to the present as much as we can. In 2006, to the surprise of many, the Palestinians had elections in Gaza and the West Bank, and Hamas, not Fatah, the party that had been in power, but now the much more radical wing, not willing to negotiate with the Israelis, they win the elections. And in 2007, in fact, they seize power in Gaza. So really from 2007, you have essentially two Palestinian states or proto-states or quasi-states, at least. One in Gaza controlled by Hamas, not willing to negotiate, at least publicly, with Israel. And then a second state in the West Bank, Fatah, that had negotiated some agreements with Israel. From this point on, both the Israelis and the Egyptians, they blockade Gaza. They really try to control what comes in and out of there with some success, but nonetheless, as we know, because of the war going on there, there's been a tremendous amount of armaments smuggled into Gaza by Hamas. And again, we can point to the Iranians for being behind a lot of this. Iranians, again, cultivating ties with Hamas. So there's this cycle of violence that continues from 2005 or 7 right up to this day. It waxes and wanes. You have attacks from Gaza into Israel. Because of the border security, increasingly those attacks are rocket attacks fired into Israel. And then the Israelis respond. There are two major Israeli incursions called the First and Second Gaza wars. You see the dates for those. But again, those were just sort of high points in the violence. The violence continued every year, has continued, until finally we get to what's sometimes called the Third Gaza War, which is the war that's occurring now. In this war, I'm sure you've followed it on the news, is a major war. It's the most serious military operation the Israelis have engaged in since Operation Peace for Galilee, the invasion of Lebanon in 1982. And it's the most serious fighting in Gaza since the 1973 war. And this is a major, major war that's obviously going to has taken a toll and will on both sides. All right, so my goal here is not to look at this war, although we could, if you have questions, I could take those, but my goal was to kind of walk you through, I think, some of the important historical elements that have led to this current crisis in the region. I'm sorry I went a little long here.
That is fine. I think this was perfect. It's a lot to digest. So I'm going to work on getting the recording out as quickly as I can, because people may want to kind of look at it again and kind of stop and take notes and kind of take it all in. So because you were so gracious, Dr. Coan, to offer your email, I'm going to send that out to everyone, and he has said that he will answer your questions via email. So we really, really appreciate your willingness to do that, Dr. Coan, and your willingness to be here. And that is all the time we have. So thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. Please, take a look at other things that we have coming up, and we hope to see you at another program. Thank you.
Thank you.